When I got the call that my uncle had been arrested again, I wasn't surprised. He was charming, reckless, and unpredictable, the kind of guy who knew his way around trouble and didn't seem to mind it. But this time felt different. It wasn't just a few months. He was facing 10 years, a decade behind bars, for possession of over a pound of cocaine. They said it was hidden in the trunk of his car, packed away as casually as groceries. It stung. He'd promised us he was clean, that his wild years were behind him. Even at Thanksgiving, he'd go out of his way to remind us all that he was on the straight and narrow. We'd had our doubts. Old habits don't vanish overnight after all, but a pound. None of us had seen that coming. My uncle swore up and down the drugs weren't his, said he was framed, that someone wanted to see him gone for good, but when we pressed him on it, he'd just clam up, muttering that spending a decade locked away was better than what they would do to him. After he was sentenced, my mum called, her voice tight, asking if I could go to his place and sort through his things. It was typical family duty, the kind of thing I couldn't turn down. I wasn't close with him, but family ties run deep enough to leave you feeling responsible, even when you know you shouldn't. So, with him locked away for the next 10 years, I volunteered to clear out his apartment, move his things to storage. I didn't know why I was so eager, but maybe I felt like it was the least I could do. The place was a disaster, exactly as I expected. His kitchen cupboards were filled with thrift store pots and pans, each one more scratched and mismatched than the last. I could see him at the stove, cigarette dangling from his lips, stirring whatever random meal he'd thrown together in those beat-up pans. The living room was its own kind of graveyard. Ashtrays covered nearly every surface, filled with weeks' worth of cigarette butts, and the walls were a deep, sickly yellow from years of constant smoke. Even the light switches had turned the same shade, crusted over from the nasty habit that had stained every inch of the place. It was clear he hadn't cracked a window in years. I found myself running my fingers along the walls, almost wondering if the yellow residue would come off. It didn't. In one corner of the room was his pride and joy, a collection of Star Trek figurines and posters, lined up on a crooked shelf he'd likely hammered up himself. He'd been a fan for as long as I could remember, always rambling about episodes I'd never seen and characters I couldn't name. Dozens of plastic figures with blank, determined stares watched me pack up their home, my uncle's treasures boxed up and ready to be hidden away for who knew how long. It took a few days, but I finally got the majority of the place packed. 3 trips in my truck, hauling boxes and crates to the storage facility across town until the apartment was stripped bare. The only things left were the stained carpet, the nicotine-coated walls, and the broken blinds barely hanging in the windows. There was no way he was getting his security deposit back. The damage was practically baked into the place. But it didn't matter anymore. As I sorted through the last of the kitchen, my hand brushed against something tucked away in the shadows of the cabinet. I pulled it out and found myself holding a small leather-bound book. The cover was cracked and worn, the leather soft from age, with a faint smell of cigarette smoke clinging to it. The pages inside were yellowed, brittle, and marked with years of kitchen chaos. Stains, smudges, and scribbled notes everywhere. The entries were scattered, written down in no particular order, almost as if whoever kept this book had jotted recipes down the moment they'd been created, without thought of organization. As I skimmed the pages, a feeling crept over me that this book might have belonged to my grandfather. He was the one who'd brought the family together, year after year, with his homemade dishes. Every holiday felt anchored by the meals he'd cooked, recipes no one had ever been able to quite replicate. This book could very well hold the secrets to those meals, a piece of him that had somehow made its way into my uncle's hands after my grandfather passed. And yet, I couldn't shake a strange sense of dread as I held it. The leather was cold against my hands, almost damp, and a chill worked its way through me as I turned the pages. It felt wrong, somehow, as if there was more in this book than family recipes. Curious about the book's origins, I brought it to my mum. She took one look at the looping handwriting on the yellowed pages and nodded, her face softening with recognition. "This was your grandfather's," she said, almost reverently, tracing her fingers along the ink. She hadn't seen it in years, and when I told her where I'd found it, a look of surprise flickered across her face. She had been searching for the book for ages, and had never realized her brother had kept it all this time. As she flipped through the pages, nostalgia mingled with something else, maybe a touch of sadness or reverence. I could tell this book meant a lot to her, which only strengthened my resolve to preserve it. Could I hang on to it a little longer? I asked. I want to scan it, make a digital copy for myself so we don't lose any of his recipes." My mum agreed without hesitation, grateful that I was taking the time to safeguard something she hadn't known was still around. So I got to work. Over the next few weeks, in the gaps of my day-to-day life, I carefully scanned each page. I wasn't too focused on the content itself, more concerned with making sure each recipe was clear and legible, and didn't pay close attention to the strange ingredients and odd notes scattered throughout. My only goal was to make the text accessible, giving life to a digital copy that would be preserved indefinitely. Once I finished, I spent a few hours merging the scanned images, piecing them together to create a seamless digital version. When it was finally done, I returned the original to my mom, feeling a strange mix of relief and satisfaction. The family recipes were now safe, and I thought that was the end of it. But that sense of unease I'd felt in the kitchen, holding that worn leather cover, lingered longer than I expected. In the months that followed, I didn't think much about the recipe book. Scanning it had been a small side project, the kind I'd meant to follow up on by actually cooking a few of my grandfather's old dishes. But like so many side projects, I got wrapped up in other things, and the book's contents drifted to the back of my mind, filed away and forgotten. Then Thanksgiving rolled around. I made my way to my parents' place, expecting the usual turkey, stuffing, and the familiar spread that had become tradition. When I got there, though, I noticed something different right away. A large bird sat in the middle of the table, roasted to perfection, but something about it didn't look right. It was too small for a turkey, and its skin looked darker, almost rougher than the golden brown I was used to. "Nice chicken," I said, figuring they'd switch things up for a change. My mum just shook her head. "It's not a chicken," she said quietly. "It's a hen." I gave her a confused look. "What's the difference?" I asked, half laughing, expecting her to shrug it off with a quick explanation. Instead, she just stared at me, her eyes unfocused as if she were lost in thought. For a moment her face seemed distant, almost blank, as though I'd asked a question she couldn't quite place. Then suddenly she blinked, her gaze snapping back to me. "It's just what the recipe called for," she said, a strange edge to her voice. Something about it made the hair on my arms prickle, but I pushed the feeling aside, figuring she'd just been caught up in the cooking chaos. Yet, as I looked at the bird again, a small flicker of unease crept in, settling in the back of my mind like an itch I couldn't scratch. After dinner, I pulled my dad aside in the kitchen, while my mum finished clearing the table. "What's the deal with Mum tonight?" I asked, keeping my voice low. He just shrugged, brushing it off with a wave of his hand. "You know how your mother is," he said with a small smile, as though her strange excitement was just one of those quirks. He didn't give it a second thought, already moving on. But I couldn't shake the weirdness. The whole meal had been off. The hen, unlike anything we'd had before, was coated in a sweet-smelling sauce that seemed to have a faint hint of walnut to it, almost masking its pale, ashen hue. The bird lay on a bed of unfamiliar greens, probably some sort of garnish, alongside perfectly sliced parsnips and radishes that seemed too neatly arranged, like it was all meant to look a certain way. The whole thing was far too elaborate for my mum's usual Thanksgiving style. When she finally sat, she led us in saying grace, her voice soft and reverent. As she began cutting into the hen, a strange glint of excitement lit up her face, one I wasn't used to seeing. She served it up, watching each of us intently as we took our first bites. I wasn't sure what I expected, but as I brought a piece to my mouth, I could tell right away this wasn't the usual Thanksgiving fare. The meat was tough, almost stringy, and didn't pull apart easily, a far cry from the tender turkey or even chicken I was used to. Mum kept glancing between my dad and me with a kind of eager glee, as though she were waiting for us to say something. It was unsettling, her eyes wide, as if she were waiting for us to uncover some hidden secret. When I finally asked, "What's got you so excited, Mum?" she just smiled, her expression softening. "Oh, it's just this cookbook you found from Grandpa's things. It's like having a part of him here with every meal I make." She spoke with a reverence I hadn't heard in her voice for a long time, as though she were talking about more than just food. I gave her a nod, trying to humor her. "Tastes good," I said, hoping she'd ease up. I enjoyed it. But in truth, I wished we'd had a more familiar Thanksgiving dinner. The meal wasn't exactly bad, but something tasted a little off. I couldn't put my finger on it, and maybe I didn't want to. After we finished, I said my goodbyes and headed home, trying to shake the lingering sense of unease. My mum's face, her excitement, kept replaying in my mind. And then there was the hen itself. Why a hen? Why the pale ashen sauce? There was something almost ritualistic in the way she'd prepared it, a strange precision I'd never seen from her before. The night stretched on, the questions gnawing at me, taking root in a way that wouldn't let me rest. When I got home, I couldn't shake the weird feeling from dinner. I sat down at my desk, opening the scanned file I'd saved to my desktop months ago. The folder had been sitting there, untouched, and now that I finally had it open, I could see why I'd put it off. The handwriting was dense and intricate, almost a kind of calligraphy, each letter curling into the next. The words seemed to dance across the pages in a strange, whimsical flow. I had to squint, leaning closer to make sense of each line. As I scrolled through the recipes, a chill ran down my spine. They had unsettling names, the kind that felt more like old spells than recipes. Mother's Last Supper, porridge, binding broth of bone and leaf, Elder's ember bread, hollow heart soup with morning onion. I wasn't sure if it was my imagination, but I could almost feel a heaviness creeping into the room, the words themselves holding an eerie energy. Then, I found it. The recipe for the dish my mother had made tonight. Ancestors' Offering. The recipe was titled in that same swirling calligraphy, and I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as I read the description. It was for a maple braised hen with black walnut and root puree, though it didn't sound like any recipe I'd ever seen. The instructions were worded strangely, written in a style that made it feel centuries old. Each ingredient was listed with specific purpose and detail, as though it held some secret power. My eyes skimmed down to the meat. It specified a hen, not just any chicken. The body must be that of a mother, it read. I felt a shiver go through me, remembering the strange way my mum had insisted on using a hen, correcting me when I'd casually referred to it as chicken. The instructions continued, noting that the hen had to be served on a bed of lamb's lettuce, a type of honeysuckle, according to a quick Google search. And then, as I read further, a chill seeped into my bones. The recipe stated it must be served just before the end of twilight, as dusk yields to night. I thought back to dinner, and the way we'd all sat down just as the last of the sun's light faded beyond the horizon. But the final instruction was the worst part, and as I read it, my stomach twisted in revulsion. The recipe called for something it referred to as ancestors' salt. The note at the bottom explained that this salt was a sprinkle of the ashes of those who have returned to the earth, with a warning to use it sparingly, as each grain remembers the one who offered it. I sat back, cold sweat breaking out across my skin, as I recalled the pale, ashen sauce coating the hen, the faint, sweet scent it gave off. My mind raced, piecing together what it implied. Had my mum actually used ashes in the meal? Had she used my grandfather's ashes? I tried to shake it off, to tell myself it was just some old folklore nonsense, but the image of her smiling face as she served us that meal, the gleam in her eyes, crept back into my mind. I felt my stomach churn, bile rising in my throat as the horrifying thoughts sank deeper. A few days later, the gnawing unease had become impossible to ignore. I told myself I was probably just overreacting, that the weird details in the recipe were nothing more than some strange family tradition I didn't understand. Still, I couldn't shake the dread that crept up every time I remembered that meal. So I decided to call my mum. I planned it out, careful to come off as casual. The last thing I wanted was for her to think I was accusing her of something as insane as putting ashes in our food. I asked about my dad, about her gardening, anything to warm her up a bit. Then I thanked her for the Thanksgiving dinner, even going so far as to say it was the best we'd had in years. When I finally brought up the recipe book, her voice brightened instantly. "Oh, thank you again for finding it," she said, sounding genuinely pleased. "I had no idea he'd catalogued so many wonderful recipes. I knew your grandfather's cooking was special, but to have all these dishes recorded like his own little legacy, it's been such a joy." I chuckled, trying to keep my tone light. "I actually looked up that dish you made us, Ancestors' Offering. Thought maybe I'd give it a try myself sometime." "Oh, really?" she replied, sounding intrigued. "Yeah, though I thought it was a little strange the recipe specifically calls for a hen, and not just a regular chicken, since they're so much tougher, and the part that says it should be the body of a mother." I let the words hang, hoping she'd jump in with some explanation that would make it all seem less sinister. For a moment there was just silence on her end. Then quietly she said, "Well, That's just how your grandfather wrote it, I suppose. Her voice was different now, lower, as if she were carefully choosing her words. My heart thumped in my chest, and I decided to press a little further. I also noticed it calls for something called Ancestors' Salt, I said, feigning confusion, pretending I hadn't read the footnote that explicitly described it. What's that supposed to be? The silence was even longer this time, stretching out until it became a ringing hum in my ears. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. I have to go, she murmured, sounding almost dazed. Before I could respond, the line clicked, leaving me in the heavy, stunned quiet. I tried calling her back immediately, but it went straight to voicemail. Her phone was off. My stomach twisted as I stared at the blank screen. I couldn't tell if I was more scared of what I might find out or of what I might already know. I hesitated, but eventually called my dad's phone, feeling a need to at least check in. When he picked up, I told him about my call with Mom and how strange she'd been acting. She went into her garden right after you two spoke, he said, sounding unconcerned. Started tending to her plants, hasn't said a word since. I tried nudging him a bit, asking if he could maybe get her to talk to me, but he just brushed it off. You're overreacting. You know how your mother is. Gets all sentimental over family things. It'll just upset her if you keep nagging her about it. Give her some space. I nodded, trying to take his advice to heart. Yeah, all right. You're probably right. After we hung up, I resolved to let it go and went about my day, chalking it up to my mum's usual habit of getting overly attached to anything with sentimental value. She'd always treated family heirlooms like they carried something sacred, almost magical. But this time, I couldn't fully shake the nagging feeling in the back of my mind, something that made it impossible to forget about that recipe book. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. Sitting back down at my computer, I opened the digital copy and scrolled aimlessly through the pages. Part of me knew it was a bad idea, but I couldn't resist. I let the file skip down to a random section, thinking I'd try making something small, something harmless. As I scrolled, I found myself staring at the very last page, which held a recipe titled Elder's Ember Bread. The instructions were minimal, yet each word seemed heavy, steeped in purpose. Beneath the title, a note read, "Best served in small portions on cold, dark nights. The taste is best enjoyed alone, lest the voices of the past linger too long." I shook my head, half amused, half unnerved. It was all nonsense, I told myself. Probably just some old superstitions my grandfather had picked up along the way. But something about it had my heart pounding just a bit harder. Ignoring the rising chill, I printed the recipe and took it to the kitchen. I'd play along, I figured. It was just bread, after all. I scanned the list of ingredients for Elder's Ember Bread, feeling time slip away as though I'd been pulled into some strange trance. My mind blurred over, details of the process fading into a fog, yet I couldn't stop moving. I gathered everything without really thinking about it, each step drawing me deeper, as though I were following some ancient, well-worn path. I remembered flashes, the sweet scent of elderberry and honey, the earthy weight of raw rye, the dry, pungent aroma of wood burnt to charcoal. At some point I murmured something under my breath, words of thanks to my ancestors that I hadn't consciously decided to speak. The smell of warmed goat's milk lingered in the air, blending with a creamy, thick butter that had blackened over low heat. A faint scent of yew ash drifted up as I worked, curling into my nose like smoke from an unseen fire. By the time I came to my senses, night had fallen, the kitchen shadowed and still, and there, sitting on the counter, was the bread. A dark, dense loaf, blackened at the crust, but glistening with an almost unnatural sheen. It looked rich and moist, and as I stared at it, a strange sense of pride swelled up within me, unnatural and unsettling, like a voice in the back of my mind was urging me to feel pleased, insisting that I'd done well. Without really thinking, I cut myself a slice and carried it to the living room, feeling compelled to enjoy my creation. I took a bite, and the bread filled my mouth with an earthy, bittersweet taste, smoky, yet tinged with a subtle berry sweetness. It was unusual, nothing like I'd ever tasted before, but it was oddly satisfying. As I chewed, a warmth bloomed deep in my chest, spreading through me like the steady heat of a wood stove. It was comforting, almost intimate, as if the bread itself were warming me from the inside out. Before I knew it, I'd finished the entire slice, not because I'd particularly enjoyed it, but because some strange sense of obligation had pushed me to finish every bite. When I set the plate down, The warmth remained. A heavy presence settled deep inside me, and in the silence that followed, I could have sworn I felt a faint rhythmic beat, a heartbeat steady and ancient, pulsing faintly beneath my skin. Over the next few weeks, I found myself drawn back to the elders' ember bread more often than I intended. I'd noticed myself in the kitchen, knife in hand, halfway through slicing a thick piece from the loaf before even realizing I'd gotten up to do it. It was instinctive, almost as if some quiet impulse guided me back to it on those quiet late nights. Each time I took a bite, that same deep warmth would swell inside me, radiating outward like embers glowing from a steady fire. But unlike the hen my mother had made, a meal that left me with a lingering sense of discomfort, the ember bread felt different. It was as though each bite carried something I couldn't quite place, something familiar and almost affectionate, like a labor of love embedded into every grain. The days blended together, but the questions didn't go away. I tried to reach out to my mother several times, hoping she might open up about the recipe book, maybe explain why we both seemed so drawn to these strange meals, but each time I brought it up, she'd evade the question, either changing the subject or claiming she was too busy to talk. She hadn't invited me over for dinner since Thanksgiving, and the distance between us felt like a slow, widening gulf. Even my dad, when I'd asked about her, shrugged it off, saying she was just going through a phase. But the coldness in her responses, her repeated avoidance of the book, only made me more certain that there was something she wasn't telling me. Still, I kept returning to the ember bread, feeling its subtle pull each time the sun set, as though I were being guided by something unseen. And each time I took a bite, it felt less like a meal and more like communion, a quiet bond that was growing stronger with every piece I consumed. After weeks of unanswered questions, I decided to reach out to my uncle at the prison. I was allowed to leave a message, so I kept it short, told him it was his nephew, wished him well, and let him know I'd left him $100 in commissary. The next day, he called me back, his voice scratchy over the line but appreciative. "Hey, thanks for the cash," he said with a short chuckle. "You know how it is in here, money makes things easier." We chatted for a bit, catching up. He'd been in and out of prison so often that I'd come to see it as his way of life. In his 60s now, he talked about his time behind bars with a kind of acceptance, almost relief. "By the time I'm out again, I'll be an old man," he said, almost amused. "It's not the worst place to grow old." Then I took a breath and brought up the reason I'd called. "I don't know if you remember, but when I was packing up your place, I found this old recipe book." I hesitated, then quickly added, I gave it to Mom. Thought she'd get a kick out of it." His response was immediate. The warm, casual tone in his voice shifted, growing cold and sharp. "Listen to me," he said, each word weighted and deliberate. "If you have that book, you need to throw it into a fire." "What?" I stammered, caught off guard. "It's just a cookbook." "It's not just a cookbook," he replied, his voice low, almost trembling. "That book, it brings out terrible things in people." He paused, as though considering how much to say. "My father, your grandfather, he was into some dark stuff you don't just find in the back of an old family recipe. And that book," he took a breath, "that book wasn't his. It belonged to his mother, your great-grandmother, passed down to him before he even knew what it was. My mother used to say those recipes were meant for desperate times." The gravity of his words settled into me, and I felt the weight of it all suddenly make sense. "They were used to survive hard times," he continued, voice quiet. "You've heard about what people did during the Great Depression, how desperate families were. But this," he exhaled sharply, "those recipes are ancient, passed down through whispers and word of mouth long before they were ever written down. But they're not for everyday meals. They're for invoking things, bringing things out, the kind of things that can take hold of you if you're not careful." My hand tightened around the phone as a cold shiver traced down my spine, my mind flashing back to the ember bread, the warmth it had left in my chest, the strange satisfaction that hadn't felt entirely my own. "Promise me," he continued, his voice almost pleading, "don't let Mom or anyone else use that book for anything casual. Those recipes can keep a person alive in hard times, sure, but they weren't meant to be used. Not unless you're ready to live with the consequences." A chill settled over me as I realized just how deep this all went. I hesitated, then told my uncle the truth. I'd already made one of the recipes. I described Elder's ember bread to him, the earthy sweetness, The warmth it filled me with, leaving out the part about how I'd almost felt compelled to eat it. He let out a harsh sigh and scolded me, his voice sharper than I'd ever heard. "You shouldn't have touched that bread. None of it. Do you understand me?" I felt a pang of guilt. "I know, I'm sorry. I promise I won't make anything else from the book." "Good," he said, his voice calming a little, "but that's not enough. You have to get that book away from my sister, your mother, before she does something she can't take back." I tried to assure him I'd do what I could, but he cut me off, his tone deadly serious. "You need to do this. Something bad will happen if you don't." Over the next few weeks, as Christmas approached, I stayed in touch with him, paying the collect call fees to keep our conversations going. Every time we talked, the discussion would circle back to the book. I'd tell him about my progress, or lack of it, how I'd tried visiting my mum, only for her to brush me off with excuses, saying she was too busy or that it wasn't a good time, and each time I talked to her, she seemed to grow colder, more distant, as if that recipe book was slowly casting a shadow over her. One day I decided to drop by without any notice at all. When I showed up on her doorstep, she didn't seem pleased to see me. "You should have called first," she said with a forced smile. "It's rude, you know, just showing up like this." Her tone was tight, her words clipped. I tried to play it off, shrugging and saying I'd just missed her and wanted to check in, but as I scanned the house, I felt a creeping sense of unease. I looked for any sign of the book, hoping I could find it and take it with me, but it was nowhere to be seen. Each time, I'd leave empty-handed, feeling like I was being watched from the shadows as I walked out the door. Every call with my uncle became more urgent, his insistence that I retrieve the book growing into a kind of desperation. "You have to try harder," he'd say, his voice strained. "If you don't get that book away from her, something's going to happen. You have to believe me." And deep down, I did believe him. The memory of the ember bread, the strange warmth, and the subtle pull of that old recipe gnawed at me, as though warning me of something far worse waiting in that book. But it was more than that. Something in my mum's voice, her distant gaze, even her scolding felt off. And every time I left her house, I felt a chill settle over me, like I was getting closer to something I wasn't prepared to see. Christmas Day finally arrived, and despite my mother's recent evasions, there was no avoiding me this time. I gathered up the presents I'd bought for them, packed them into my car, and drove to their house, hoping the tension that had grown between us would somehow ease in the warmth of the holiday. When I knocked, she opened the door and offered a quick, half-hearted hug. The scent of baked ham and sweet glaze wafted out, thick and rich, and for a second, I thought maybe she'd set aside that strange recipe book and return to her usual cooking. I relaxed a little, hoping the day would be less tense than I'd feared. "Where's Dad?" I asked, glancing around for any sign of him. "Oh, he's in the garage," she said, waving it off. "Got a new gadget he's fussing over, you know him." She gestured toward the dining room, where plates and holiday decorations were already set up. "Why don't you sit down? Lunch is almost ready." I took off my coat, glancing back at her. She was already turned away, busying herself with the last touches on the table, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of discomfort. Her movements were stiff, almost mechanical, and I could sense the familiar warmth in her was missing. It was like she was there, but somehow absent. Not wanting to disobey my mother on Christmas, I placed my gifts with the others under the tree and took my seat at the dining table. The plate in front of me was polished and waiting, a silver fork and knife perfectly aligned on either side, but the emptiness of it left an unsettling pit in my stomach. "Should I go get Dad?" I called out, glancing back toward the hallway that led to the garage. He'd usually be the first to greet me, especially on a holiday. The silence from him was off-putting. "He'll come when he's ready," my mother replied, her voice carrying from the kitchen. "He had a big breakfast, so he can join us later. Let's go ahead and start." Something about her response didn't sit right. It wasn't like my dad to skip a Christmas meal, not for any reason. A small, insistent thought tugged at me. Maybe it was the book again, casting shadows over everything in my mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "I'll just go say hello to him," I said, rising from the table. Before I'd even taken a step, she entered the dining room, carrying a large ham on an ornate silver platter. The meat was dark and glossy, almost blackened, the glaze thick and rich, coating every criss-crossed cut she'd made in the skin. The bone jutted out starkly from the center, pale against the charred flesh. "Sit down," she said, her voice oddly stern, a hint of irritation slipping through her usual holiday warmth. "This is a special meal. We should enjoy it together." I stopped, glancing from her to the closed door of the garage, the words "special meal" repeating in my head, setting off warning bells. Still, I stood my ground, my stomach churning. "I just want to see Dad, that's all. I haven't even said hello." Her face tensed, her grip tightening around the platter as her voice rose. "Sit down and enjoy lunch with me." The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding, like a command I was supposed to follow without question. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was lying just beneath the surface of her insistence. "No," I snapped, my voice echoing through the dining room. "I've had enough of this, Mom. You've been obsessed with that damn recipe book, and I'm done with it." My heart pounded as I looked at her, my words hanging thick in the silence, but I didn't back down. "I'm going to the garage to get Dad. We're putting an end to this right now." Her face contorted, desperation spilling from her eyes. "Please, just sit down," she pleaded, her voice cracking as she looked at the untouched plate in front of me. "Let's have this meal together. It's important." I took a step toward the garage, determined to get my dad out here, to make him see how far she'd gone. That book had wormed its way too deep into her mind. She shrieked and threw herself in front of the door, arms outstretched as if to block my path. Her face was flushed, her voice frantic. "Don't go in there. Please just sit down. Enjoy the meal. Savor it," she begged, her hands trembling as she reached out, practically pleading. There was a desperation in her voice that sounded like fear, not just of me, but of what lay beyond that door. "Mum, you're acting crazy. We need to talk, and I need to see Dad." I tried to push past her, but she held her ground, her body a thin, shaky barrier. "Please," she whispered, voice thin and desperate. "You don't understand. Don't disturb him." "Dad!" I called out, raising my voice over her pleas. Silence answered at first, followed by a muffled sound, a low, guttural moan, thick and unnatural, rising from the other side of the door. I froze, my blood turning cold as the sound slipped into a horrible, wet gurgle. My mother's face went white, her eyes wide with terror as she realized I'd heard him. I felt a surge of adrenaline take over, and before she could react, I shoved her aside and yanked open the door. The sight that met me would be seared into my memory forever. I stepped into the garage and froze, my stomach lurching at the scene before me. My dad lay sprawled across his workbench, his face pale and slick with sweat. His right leg was tied tightly with a belt just above the thigh, a makeshift tourniquet attempting to staunch the flow of blood. A pillowcase was wrapped around the raw, exposed flesh where his leg had been crudely severed, and blood pooled on the concrete floor beneath him, glistening in the cold fluorescent light. He lifted his head weakly, his eyes glassy and unfocused. His mouth moved, trying to form words, a barely audible rasp escaping as he struggled to speak. "Help me!" I didn't waste a second. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, my fingers shaking so badly it was hard to hit the right buttons. My mother's shrill screams erupted from behind me as she lunged into the garage, her hands clawing at the air, pleading. "Stop, please, just sit down, just have lunch with me," she wailed, her voice high-pitched and frantic. Her face was twisted in desperation, tears streaming down her cheeks. But I didn't listen. I couldn't. I backed up, keeping a wide berth between her and my dad, and relayed the horror I was seeing to the dispatcher. "It's my dad. He's lost his leg. He's barely conscious," I stammered, voice cracking. "Please, you need to hurry." The dispatcher assured me that help was on the way, asking me to stay on the line, but my mother's desperate cries filled the garage, creating a haunting echo. She clutched at her head, her fingers digging into her scalp as she repeated, "Please, just come back to the table. Just eat. You have to eat." I kept my distance, heart pounding, as I watched her spiral into a frantic haze. But she never laid a finger on me. She only circled back to the door, wailing and begging in a chilling frenzy that made my blood run cold. The police arrived within minutes, their lights flashing against the house, and rushed into the garage to assess the situation. My mother resisted, screaming and flailing as they restrained her, her pleas becoming incoherent sobs as they led her away. I could barely breathe as I watched them take her, her voice a haunting wail that echoed down the driveway, begging me to come back and join her at the table. Paramedics rushed in and began working on my dad, quickly stabilizing him and loading him onto a stretcher. I followed them outside, numb with shock, barely able to process the scene that had unfolded. In the frigid December air, my mind reeled, looping over her chilling words and the horrible sight in that garage. That Christmas, the warmth of family and familiarity had turned into something I could barely comprehend, twisted into a nightmare I would never forget. I stayed by my father's side every day at the hospital, watching over him as he slowly regained strength. On good days, when the painkillers were working and his mind was clearer, he told me everything he could remember about the last month with my mother. She'd been making strange, elaborate meals every single night since Thanksgiving, insisting he try each one. At first, he thought it was just a new holiday tradition, a way to honor Grandpa's recipes, but as the dishes grew more unusual, more disturbing, he realized something was deeply wrong. She had started mumbling to herself while she cooked, almost like she was speaking to someone who wasn't there. Eventually, he'd stopped eating at the house altogether, sneaking out for meals at nearby diners, finding any excuse he could to avoid her food. He even admitted that on Christmas morning, when he tried to leave, she had drugged his coffee. Everything went hazy after that, and the next thing he remembered was waking up to pain and the horror of what she'd done to his leg. We discussed the recipe book in hushed tones, both coming to the same terrible conclusion. The book had changed her. My father was hesitant to believe anything so sinister at first, but the memories of her frantic insistence, the look in her eyes, made him certain. Somehow, in some dark, twisted way, the book had drawn her into its thrall. By New Year's Eve, he was discharged from the hospital. I promised him I'd stay with him as he recovered, my own guilt over the role I'd unwittingly played gnawing at me. He accepted, his eyes carrying the quiet pain of someone forever altered. My mother, meanwhile, was undergoing evaluation in a psychiatric hospital. Since that Christmas, I hadn't seen her. I'd gotten updates from the doctors. They said she was calm, coherent, but that her words remained disturbing. She admitted to doing what she did to my father, repeating over and over, "We need to do what we must to survive the darkest days of the year." Her voice would drop to a whisper, a distant look in her eyes, as though the phrase were a sacred mantra. On New Year's Eve, as the minutes ticked toward midnight, my father and I went out to his backyard fire pit. I carried the recipe book, feeling its familiar weight in my hands one last time. Without a word, I tossed it into the fire, watching as the flames curled around the old leather, devouring the yellowed pages. It crackled and twisted in the heat, the recipes that had plagued us dissolving into ash. My father's hand on my shoulder was the only anchor I had as the smoke rose, dissipating into the cold night air. But as the last ember faded, I felt a pang of something like regret. Later, as I sat alone, staring at my computer, I hovered over the file on my desktop. The digital copy, each recipe scanned and preserved in perfect, chilling detail. I knew I should delete it, erase any trace of the book that had shattered my family. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to do it. I fear that it may have a hold on me. Months had passed since I walked away from the Kellerman estate and the firm itself. The weight of my decision lingered over me, a strange mixture of relief and unease. No more case files piled on my desk, no more late-night briefs or motions, no more courtroom battles. Yet the spectre of my disbarment hearing loomed ever closer, creeping into my thoughts at every turn. Worse still, the eerie silence from the Kellerman family, whose estate I had been entangled with for so long, gnawed at my soul. Their calls had stopped abruptly, the letters ceased, but I couldn't shake the sensation that something wasn't finished. Something lingered, like an unfinished chapter in a book I had left half-read. Each day, I rarely left my apartment, and when I did, it was only for the most basic necessities. My usual bustling street, filled with the hum of daily life, seemed quieter than usual, as though I had slipped into another realm. The normal sounds of the city felt distant, the usual energy muted. It was as if the world had moved on without me, leaving me behind as a ghost in my own life. I spent hours by the window, watching the people below going about their routines, waiting for something, anything, to break the oppressive stillness. My mind played cruel tricks, making me believe I could see someone familiar just around the corner. Perhaps the stern face of my managing partner, with that knowing, almost predatory smile. But no one came. I waited, surrounded by silence. Then one early morning, just as the grey light of dawn filtered through the curtains, I heard it. A heavy, deliberate knock on the door. I froze, my pulse quickening. I stared at the door, hesitant, then slowly rose, my bare feet making soft sounds on the wooden floor. I peered through the peephole, half expecting to see some faceless figure lurking there, but there was no one. I creaked open the door, heart pounding, my eyes scanning the hallway, searching for any sign of movement. There was none. Only a thick, yellow envelope sitting innocently on my welcome mat, obscuring its once cheerful greeting. The envelope had no return address, no markings at all. It was hefty, heavier than I would have expected. I knelt down, gingerly picking it up, my heart racing as I tore open the top. Inside was a single crumpled photograph. The moment I pulled it out, a chill ran down my spine. The photo was of the Kellerman family, standing in a semicircle around a grave. Their faces were twisted with grief, anger, and something else, something far more primal, an animalistic desperation. I could barely look at it. The dread was so visceral, so thick in the air that I quickly shoved the photo back into the envelope, my hands trembling. What did this mean? A warning? A message? The weight of the Kellerman's secrets pressed down on me, as though a part of me had never left their estate, entangled in their cursed web. That evening, sleep evaded me. The photograph haunted my thoughts, replaying again and again in my mind. The grave, the faces, the tension. What had happened since I left them? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something vital, that they were still reaching out to me, dragging me back into their world. As the hours dragged on, I made a decision. I had to know what happened, what was buried in that grave. The next day, I set out to find the cemetery from the photograph. It took hours, searching through the outskirts of the town, but finally, I found it. The graveyard was old, crumbling, tucked away in a forgotten corner where time itself seemed to have stalled. A dense fog clung to the ground, swirling around the worn gravestones, the scent of rain mixed with the earthy, damp smell of freshly turned soil. I wandered through the graves, the name Richard Kellerman echoing in my head, guiding me. My footsteps were soft on the wet grass, and the sound of my breathing seemed amplified in the eerie silence. After what felt like an eternity, I found it, the grave from the photo. It was poorly maintained, the headstone weathered and cracked, almost overtaken by weeds. The name engraved was just as I suspected, Richard Kellerman. I knelt before the grave, my fingers brushing aside the overgrown grass. A chill ran through me, colder than the damp air surrounding me. What had Richard done to warrant such grief from his family? What dark secrets had he taken to his grave? Suddenly I heard footsteps, the crunching of gravel behind me. I whipped around, my heart racing. Standing there was the youngest Kellerman, his face pale, eyes wide with something I couldn't place, panic, anger, or perhaps a mix of both. His voice was a harsh whisper as he stepped forward, the fog swirling around him. "What are you doing here?" he hissed, his breath ragged, as though he had run for miles. I needed to know," I stammered, rising to my feet. "You shouldn't be here," he growled, his eyes flaring with anger. "This isn't your place. You think you can just walk away from this? Walk away from us?" "What is it?" I asked, though part of me already knew. His face grew redder, his movements agitated as he stepped closer. "It's a curse," he spat. "What he did, what we did because of him, you have no idea what you've stepped into." A gust of wind tore through the cemetery, the fog thickening, swirling violently around us. I could feel the air change, growing colder, darker. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, their forms twisting in the corner of my vision, as if they were watching, waiting. "They're coming for you," the youngest Kellerman whispered, stepping back, his eyes darting around as if he could sense something I couldn't. Before I could respond, a low, keening sound filled the air, a haunting wail that sent a shiver down my spine. The fog thickened, and out of the mist, figures began to emerge. The rest of the Kellerman family, their faces twisted in agony, their bodies bound by invisible chains that weighed them down. Their eyes, those hollow, desperate eyes, locked onto me. "You shouldn't have returned," the patriarch's second wife cried, stepping forward, her face streaked with tears. "You're the one who will awaken him." "Awaken who?" I shouted, backing away from the advancing figures, my heart racing. "Richard," she wailed, her voice cracking with the weight of her despair. He kept us from the truth. And now you've brought it back. You've brought him back! The youngest Kellerman, his face twisted in anguish, grabbed me by the arm. Leave! He shouted. Get away before it's too late. You don't understand what you've done. But it was already too late. The fog swirled around us, the shadows stretching into grotesque shapes, and the figures of the Kellerman family closed in. Their hands reached out, grasping for me, pulling me into their darkness. You will bear our truth, one of them cried, their voice barely a whisper above the howling wind. You will be bound to us, forever. The ground beneath my feet shifted, and suddenly I was no longer in the cemetery. I was standing in an empty courtroom, the air crackling with energy. The walls bled shadows, dark and twisting, like living things. The Kellerman family sat in the jury box, their faces masks of anguish, betrayal and rage. Welcome to your trial, lawyer. Richard's voice echoed through the darkness. He appeared in the center of the room, his figure tall and imposing, his smile cold and cruel. You wanted the truth, he growled, his voice reverberating through the air. Now you'll live it. The courtroom dissolved into the cemetery once more, the family's twisted screams piercing the night. Their cries echoed in my head, accusations, memories, pain, all of it crashing down on me like a wave. I felt their agony, their despair, their dark secrets tearing at my sanity. And in the midst of it all, I saw him. Richard Kellerman. His face, that cruel, knowing smile, twisted with satisfaction. He leaned down, whispering in my ear as the shadows closed in around me. I've given you a gift, he hissed, his voice dripping with malice. You're bound to us now, forever. The world went black, the shadows swallowing me whole. I woke up, gasping for breath, my body drenched in sweat. I was back in my apartment, my heart racing, my head pounding. The memories of the cemetery, of the family, of Richard's cruel grin, all of it rushed back to me in a dizzying blur. I sat up, rubbing my temples, trying to piece together what had just happened. My neighbor's voice broke through the fog, calling out to me from the other side of the door. Are Yin's okay? I blinked, still disoriented, the remnants of the nightmare clinging to me like a second skin. What? I managed to croak, my voice raw. You were sleeping on your doorstep, bud. I glanced around, realizing I was indeed sitting on the cold concrete just outside my apartment door. The events of the night, the fog, the grave, the Kellermans, everything felt so vivid, too real to have been a mere dream. But here I was, back in the mundane, with my neighbor staring at me with a concerned expression. Long night, I muttered, brushing off the encounter as best as I could. He didn't look convinced, but shrugged and wandered off. I shakily stood up, my mind still racing as I fumbled with my keys, pushing my way back into my apartment. The door clicked shut behind me, but I didn't feel safe, not here, not anywhere. I took a few steps forward, and that's when I noticed it. Another envelope, this time lying on the floor just inside the door. It was smaller than the first, lighter. I knelt down to pick it up, my hands trembling as I tore it open. Inside was a single USB drive. No note, no explanation, just the drive, sitting ominously in my hand. I rushed over to my desk, shoving the drive into the nearest port and pulling up the contents. A single folder appeared on the screen titled Family. My heart pounded in my chest as I hesitated, staring at the folder's name. I didn't want to know. I didn't want to see. But I knew I had to. I clicked on it, and a series of video files appeared, each labeled with a date. The most recent one caught my eye. Final Testimony. I clicked on the file, my breath catching in my throat as the screen flickered to life. The grainy video showed the Kellerman family gathered around a dimly lit room, the flickering light of candles casting grotesque shadows on their faces. They looked worse than the last time I saw them, hollow-eyed, sunken-cheeked, as if the weight of their curse had worn them down to their very bones. Richard, a woman's voice trembled off-screen. If you're watching this, then you've found a way to escape your fate. But I know this, the curse isn't broken. It merely waits for another to take your place. The video abruptly cut to black and then flickered back on, this time focusing on Richard himself. He sat at the head of a long dining table, a glass of wine in front of him, his fingers lightly tapping the surface. His smile was the same cold, calculating grin that had haunted me in my nightmares. Welcome back to the family, Richard said, his voice low, almost soothing. You've been chosen. We're bound together now, whether you like it or not. The video cut once more, the camera now panning to the other members of the family. One by one, they spoke in hushed tones, recounting their experiences with the curse. Each testimony was worse than the last. They spoke of nightmares that never ended, of voices whispering in the dark, of things lurking just out of sight, waiting to strike when their guard was down. They spoke of the terrible choices they had made to survive, choices no one should ever have to make. "Can you hear them?" one of the family members asked, their voice cracking with fear. The whispers, they're always there. Once they get inside your head, they never leave. The words washed over me, heavy and oppressive. My chest tightened as I watched the family, their confessions like a noose tightening around my neck. Each word seemed to pull me deeper into their cursed world, until I could feel the weight of their despair pressing down on me. The video continued, the atmosphere growing darker and more oppressive with each passing moment. The flickering candlelight seemed to twist and warp the shadows, making them appear almost alive, as if they were waiting for something, waiting for me. Then the screen cut to black, and when the video returned, it showed Richard standing at the head of the table once more. His face was obscured by shadows, but his voice was unmistakable. "You will face the truth," he snarled, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "In life, I controlled this family. I bent them to my will. In death, I will do the same. And you, lawyer, you will be my herald. There is no escape." He slammed his hand down on the table, the sound reverberating through my speakers with a deafening crack. The screen flickered, the shadows dancing wildly around him as his voice echoed one final time. "There is no escape." The video ended, the screen going black, leaving me in the eerie silence of my apartment. I sat there for what felt like hours, unable to move, my mind reeling from the weight of what I had just seen. My heart raced, my thoughts tangled in a web of fear and confusion. Richard's words played over and over in my head. I could hear his voice, low and taunting, whispering in the back of my mind. There was no escape. I was bound to him now, to the curse, just like the Kellermans. I didn't know what to do, where to go. I felt trapped in my own life, surrounded by shadows I couldn't outrun. Every corner of my apartment felt haunted, every sound magnified by my growing paranoia. The Kellermans' whispers were with me now, following me everywhere I went. The sun was beginning to rise when I finally stood up, my body heavy with exhaustion, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, twisted with grief and desperation, reaching out for me, dragging me into their cursed world. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't wait for them to come to me. I had to confront the curse head on, to seek out the truth behind Richard's twisted hold over his family. I needed answers, no matter the cost. With a shaky resolve, I grabbed my coat and stepped out into the cold morning air. The streets were quiet, the usual bustle of the city still asleep, but I could feel it, the weight of the curse hanging in the air, pulling me toward the Kellerman estate like an invisible thread. I walked for hours, my mind buzzing with questions and fears, until I finally found myself standing before the gates of the estate once more. The fog hung heavy around the crumbling mansion, the iron gates creaking softly in the wind. The sight of the estate sent a shiver down my spine, but I knew I couldn't turn back now. I pushed the gates open, the sound echoing in the stillness of the morning. The path leading up to the mansion was overgrown and wild, the once pristine grounds now a tangled mess of weeds and decay. As I approached the front door, the same oppressive sense of dread washed over me, stronger than ever before. I reached for the door, my fingers trembling as I pushed it open. The interior of the mansion was just as I remembered it, dark, crumbling, filled with the stench of rot and decay. But there was something different now. The air was thicker, heavier, as if the very walls of the estate were closing in on me. I made my way through the winding halls, each step echoing in the eerie silence. The portraits of the Kellerman family lined the walls, their eyes following me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I could hear their whispers now, faint and distant, calling to me from somewhere deep within the house. Finally, I reached the door to the room where it had all started, the room with the chest. The door was ajar, just like the first time I had been here, but this time I could feel something waiting for me on the other side, something dark, something hungry. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit by the flickering light of candles, just as it had been in the video. The chest sat in the center of the room, its lid closed. but I could feel its presence like a weight on my chest. The book I had seen was gone, but the air was thick with the same oppressive energy that had filled the room before. And then I saw him. Richard. He stood at the far end of the room, his figure shrouded in darkness, but his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, were locked on me. "You've come back," he said, his voice soft but menacing. "I knew you would." I took a step forward, my heart racing, the weight of his presence pressing down on me. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, my voice shaky but defiant. Richard's smile widened, his eyes gleaming in the candlelight. "You already know the answer," he replied, his voice low and smooth. "You've always known." The room seemed to shift around me, the shadows growing darker, deeper, until they swallowed everything but Richard and the chest. I could feel the curse pressing down on me, suffocating me, pulling me into its depths. "You will carry our truth," Richard whispered, his voice echoing through the darkness. "You are one of us now." The ground beneath me trembled, the air crackling with energy as the shadows closed in around me. And then everything went black. It's hard to know where to begin when you're telling the story of the worst thing that's ever happened to you. How do you describe something that has haunted you for nearly 2 decades, reshaped the very fabric of who you are, and left you scarred in ways even you don't fully understand? And what if it's the kind of story that, if told, could stir up old wounds that others, namely my brother Marcus, have spent years trying to bury? If he ever found this, he'd break his decade-long silence just to curse me for dredging up something that, in his mind, is better left forgotten. But it's not just his story, it's mine too, and sometimes to heal, you need to let the poison out. The summer when it all began was hot, unbearably hot. We lived in a quiet, forgettable Midwestern town where the sun beat down on cracked sidewalks, where air conditioning was a luxury reserved for better neighborhoods. It was the mid-2000s, and I had just turned 7. To me, that summer was a blur of sticky ice cream cones, sweltering heat, and a strange obsession with trying to get my older brother, Marcus, to play with me. He was 17, moody, and couldn't stand my constant pleas for attention. He preferred the solitude of his room, where he spent most of his days listening to music, locking me out, and waiting for high school to end so he could leave this godforsaken town behind. Mum was a school teacher. I think a lot of people in small towns have this picture in their head of what a teacher's life must be like. Stable, safe, cushy even. They think of tenure, long summer breaks, and decent paychecks. That wasn't the case for us. Mum worked long hours, and the pay wasn't nearly enough to cover all the bills. What little we had came from Marcus's dad, sending child support when he felt like it. My dad, he wasn't in the picture. In fact, I didn't even know if he was alive. Sometimes I wonder if I ever crossed his mind, but that's another story. Our house, though big to my young eyes, was a mess. The kind of place where the landlord shows up once every few years, pretending to care, but only ever fixes things with quick patches and broken promises. There was water damage in the corners of the ceiling, mold that grew in odd patches behind furniture, and drafty windows that let in the summer heat like an unwelcome guest. Every winter, we'd huddle in blankets, the heater working overtime just to keep us from freezing. But to me, at that age, it was still home, a place filled with my mum's laughter when she wasn't tired, and Marcus's occasional attempts to be a good brother when he wasn't brooding. That summer, something started in the house, something small, something I didn't think much of at the time. It was a soft, scratching sound, like the faint tapping of tiny claws against the walls. It started in Mum's room, usually at night. I'd hear it through the thin walls that separated our bedrooms. At first, it didn't bother me. In fact, I found it a little comforting. It was a familiar sound in the otherwise silent house, like the house itself was alive and breathing with us. But Mum didn't like it. She said it was probably rats or mice that had gotten into the walls. I remember her muttering curses under her breath, setting out traps and praying it wasn't something worse, like a squirrel or a raccoon, which we couldn't afford to call an exterminator to deal with. The house wasn't infested, just old, and the occasional pest was a part of life. Weeks went by, and the scratching persisted, but nothing ever touched the traps. Mum checked them religiously, swearing under her breath every time they came up empty. The scratching would move from room to room, sometimes starting above her bed, then moving to the wall above mine. At first, it was almost soothing, lulling me to sleep on those hot summer nights, but soon it stopped abruptly, and we all hoped it was over. That was when the smell started. It was faint at first, a subtle, unpleasant odor in Mum's room, like something had spoiled, but nothing overwhelming. We thought maybe it was the trash or a dead rat in the wall. It lingered, growing stronger as the days passed. The worst of it seemed to settle in Mum's room, and no matter what she did, air fresheners, candles, keeping the windows open, the smell clung to the air like a sour mist. Mum finally had enough. I think she wanted us out of the house so she could deal with it herself. That's why she sent Marcus and me to Aunt Monica's house for the night. Aunt Monica lived on the other side of town. She wasn't much for kids, but she was nice enough, kind-hearted in a distant way. I remember her buying us McDonald's for dinner, letting us stay up late to watch movies, and trying to distract me from my constant questions about when Mum would come get us. The next day, we returned home, but Mum wasn't there. The door was unlocked, but the house was empty. I started to worry, but Marcus, being the perpetually indifferent older brother that he was, brushed it off. "She's probably out shopping or running errands or something," he said, shrugging. That night, the scratching returned. It was louder this time, but still faint enough to be almost comforting. It moved from Mum's room to mine, tapping softly against the walls above my head. The sound lulled me to sleep, but when I woke the next day, Mum still wasn't home. "Well, when is she ever home?" Marcus mumbled when I asked again. The next few days were a blur of growing discomfort. The scratching became louder, more insistent, moving from room to room at odd hours of the night and day. Marcus was getting more irritable, snapping at me every time I asked about Mum. The house itself seemed to grow heavier, the air thick with heat and that terrible smell. It was no longer just in Mum's room. It had spread through the house, seeping into every corner, making it hard to breathe without gagging. Marcus grew increasingly frustrated. One afternoon, after hearing the scratching move along the wall in the living room, he snapped. "Goddamn mice!" he muttered, kicking the wall with more force than I expected. The drywall caved slightly, leaving a small, noticeable dent. He looked at me with wide eyes, panic flickering across his face for just a moment before he muttered, "Don't tell Mum." But Mum wasn't there to notice, and the scratching only grew louder. The nights were the worst. The scratching became almost violent, like something was clawing at the walls, desperate to escape. It was no longer a comforting sound. It was haunting, like someone was trapped inside, banging on the walls, begging to be let out. The stench grew unbearable, and Marcus, who had done his best to pretend everything was fine, began showing signs of fear. One morning, I found him in the kitchen trying to call someone, anyone to help. His hands were shaking, and though he tried to put on a brave face when he saw me, I had already caught the fear in his eyes. That was when I knew it wasn't just me who was terrified. Marcus was scared too. The heat was relentless, cooking us alive in that house with no AC. I was soaked with sweat, barely able to sleep at night with the constant banging and scratching reverberating through the walls. Marcus finally relented and let me sleep in his bed after one particularly bad night when I woke up sobbing, convinced that something or someone was going to come through the walls and get me. A week had passed, and Mum was still gone. The house was a nightmare, filled with the stench of rot and the sound of something clawing at the walls, trying to break free. Marcus had duct taped over the small hole he'd kicked in the wall, but even that didn't stop the smell. It only seemed to make it worse. The duct tape bubbled out from the pressure behind it, and flies began to gather, their low buzzing adding another layer of horror to the already unbearable atmosphere. I tried to distract myself with TV, sitting on the couch in the living room and pretending everything was normal. I didn't look at the wall, didn't think about the tape or the stench, but then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. Movement. The tape, which had been bulging for days, was shifting. At first, I thought I imagined it, but then I saw something, a small, pale shape, push its way out from under the tape, wriggling its way down the wall and onto the floor. I froze, my heart racing as more pale, shiny things started to push through, maggots. I screamed. Marcus came running, crowbar in hand, and when he saw what was happening, he let out a choked sound, half disgust, half rage. Without thinking, he charged at the wall, swinging the crowbar with all his strength. The first blow barely made a dent, but he swung again and again, each hit louder. more frantic, until the drywall crumbled, revealing a large, gaping hole. And then the house screamed. A wave of black erupted from the wall, a buzzing, pulsating mass of flies that spewed out with such force that Marcus and I had to drop to the floor to avoid being swallowed by the swarm. The sound was deafening, a horrific chorus of buzzing that seemed to vibrate through the very bones of the house. The black cloud of flies moved like a living entity, swirling around the room, a chaotic storm of wings and noise. More and more poured out from the hole, as though the wall itself had been holding them back until now, unable to contain the festering mass any longer. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick with the rancid smell, and the sound of the flies drowned out everything else. My body was shaking uncontrollably, and I buried my face in my arms, trying to shield myself from the nightmare. Marcus lay beside me, his face pale and streaked with sweat. His chest heaved as he gasped for air, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. He tried to yell something to me, but his voice was lost in the overwhelming roar of the flies. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, the swarm began to thin out. The black mass of flies slowly started to settle, their buzzing growing quieter. I dared to peek out from behind my arms, my heart still hammering in my chest. The flies had blanketed the ceiling, forming a thick, writhing carpet of black. But what caught my attention wasn't the flies, it was the hole in the wall. It had grown larger, much larger, and the sight of it made my stomach twist with nausea. The smell that wafted out of the gaping hole was beyond anything I had ever experienced. So foul, so overwhelming that my eyes watered and bile rose in my throat. The stench of decay, of something long dead and festering, filled the air, and I couldn't stop myself from gagging. Marcus, despite the fear etched into his face, stood up slowly. His body was tense, his movements cautious as he approached the wall. My whole being screamed for him to stop, to leave it alone, to run as far away from that cursed hole as possible, but I couldn't speak. My voice was frozen in my throat, choked by terror. The house was eerily silent now, save for the low, persistent buzzing of the flies above us. Marcus was inches from the wall when a creaking sound echoed through the room. It was a deep, unsettling noise, like the groan of old wood under pressure or the snap of bones shifting. Marcus froze, his hand raised as if he were about to reach into the hole. His eyes flickered with hesitation, and for a moment I thought he would turn back. But before he could move, something large and dark tumbled out of the hole and crashed onto the floor with a sickening crack. The sound was wet, grotesque, like something heavy and bloated hitting the ground. It took me a moment to register what I was looking at. The thing that had fallen from the wall was swollen, discolored, its skin stretched tight over a bloated, decaying mass. White maggots crawled over its surface, wriggling in and out of the bloated flesh, and tufts of what looked like fur and teeth lay scattered around it. I didn't understand at first. I couldn't comprehend the horror in front of me. And then, in a moment of gut-wrenching clarity, I realized what it was. It was her. It was Mum. The body that lay crumpled on the floor, rotting and crawling with maggots, was our mother. Her skin was purple and bloated, her once gentle face now twisted into a grotesque mask of death. Her eyes, oh God, her eyes, were wide and black, staring blankly ahead, as if they had witnessed something too horrifying to comprehend. Her mouth was frozen in a horrific screech, as though she had died mid-scream. I screamed louder than I ever had in my life, a sound that ripped through the stillness of the house, tearing at my throat until I could barely breathe. I collapsed to the floor, my body convulsing with sobs as the image of Mum's decaying face burned itself into my mind. I couldn't look away. I couldn't escape the reality of what I was seeing. Marcus stood frozen, his face pale, his mouth hanging open in shock. He stumbled backward, retching violently as the stench of the corpse overwhelmed him. He collapsed to his knees, vomiting on the floor as tears streamed down his face. The tough, indifferent facade he had maintained for weeks shattered in that moment. He was just as terrified, just as broken as I was. The room spun around me, the walls closing in, the buzzing of the flies growing louder in my ears, the stench, the sight of Mum's rotting corpse, the horror of it all. It was too much. My vision blurred, and the world around me faded into darkness as I lost consciousness. I woke up in a hospital bed, the sterile smell of disinfectant filling my nostrils. My head throbbed and I felt disoriented, my mind struggling to piece together what had happened. Slowly, the memories flooded back. Mum, the wall, the flies, Marcus. My body tensed as the horror of it all came rushing back to me. A nurse appeared by my side, her face kind but concerned. She spoke softly, but I barely registered her words. All I could think about was Mum. Where was Marcus? What had happened after I passed out? In the days and weeks that followed, the authorities questioned us endlessly. Detectives, social workers, police officers. They all wanted to know the same thing. What happened? How had Mum ended up inside the wall? Why hadn't we called anyone? The questions were endless, and no one seemed satisfied with our answers. I was only 7. What could I say? I barely understood what had happened myself. Marcus took the brunt of the interrogation. He was older, responsible for me while Mum was gone. The police grilled him for hours, trying to figure out why we hadn't reported her missing sooner, why we had stayed in the house despite the stench, despite the scratching. They didn't believe us when we told them about the noises in the walls, the relentless scratching that had followed us from room to room. They didn't understand that we had no idea Mum was dead. How could we have known? Eventually, the investigation stalled. There were no clear answers. The coroner's report said that Mum had died from a broken neck, and that she had been dead for days by the time her body was found. But how had she ended up in the wall? No one could explain that. The case was eventually closed, the details left unresolved, the mystery unsolved. Marcus and I never recovered from that summer. We went to live with Aunt Monica after the house was deemed uninhabitable, and though she tried her best to care for us, the damage was done. Marcus withdrew into himself, barely speaking to anyone, not even me. He left as soon as he turned 19, cutting all ties with the past, with me, with everything that reminded him of what had happened. I tried to reach out to him for years, but he never responded. Eventually, I gave up. I haven't spoken to Marcus in over a decade now. He's a ghost, a shadow of the brother I once knew, and I can't blame him. That summer broke something in both of us. I still have nightmares, vivid, horrifying dreams of Mom's rotting body, of the scratching in the walls, of the black mass of flies that seemed to come from nowhere. Therapy hasn't helped. Nothing has. I've spent nearly 20 years trying to make sense of what happened, trying to piece together the fragments of my shattered childhood. But the truth is, there are no answers. There's only the memory of that summer, and the heavy, suffocating silence that has followed me ever since. Maybe by sharing this I can finally start to let go. Maybe by telling the world, I can begin to heal. But deep down, I know the nightmares will never stop, the scratching will never fade, and I will never truly be free of the horrors that house and that summer left behind. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.